I could just have your attention for about an hour, please. I'm Jamie Belich, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to chair this session celebrating the launch of Elleke's wonderful book, Indian Arrivals. I can honestly recommend it, and it's available at a ludicrously cheap price out there of £24 for those of you who are interested. It's a wonderful work. At first I thought it might be intimating another in the long sequence of domestications by India of incursive cultures. But in fact it's far more than that. It's a kind of reverse colonial ricochet that looks at things going from India, bouncing back off Britain to India, and does a wonderful job of that. So I can honestly recommend it. Now, because I'm simply chairing, I won't bother you with my ignorant blather any further, but will instead introduce our three speakers before inviting the first of them to address us. Megan Robb, who's a lecturer in the Oriental Institute here and a junior research fellow at New College. Faisal Devji, who's of course our main man in Indian history here, a university reader in modern South Asian history. And Santanu Das, who's reader of English literature at King's College London. Thank you all very much indeed for coming along and joining us all in celebrating Elleke's achievement. We'll start with Santanu. 10 minutes each, no more please.
I'll just
stay where you are if you like.
Thanks. In a shingle beach near Hastings, two recently arrived Indian women are greeted by an English lady. And I'll just quote a few lines from a poem with which Elleke starts her book. She passed us, then she came again, observing at a glance that we were strangers, one in pain. Then asked, were we from France? We talked a while, some roses red that seemed as wet with tears. She gave my sister, and she said, God bless you both, my dears. In many ways, this is the primal scene of Elleke Boehmer's important and beautifully textured book, Indian Arrivals, 1870 to 1915. And she plunges us straight into the poem Near Hastings, written by the Victorian Indian poet Toru Dutt in 1876. Calling it, I quote, probably the first poem in the English language to represent a British-Indian encounter on British soil, Boehmer notes, and I quote, with Near Hastings, Dutt precociously explored something of the cultural strangeness, anxiety and hesitation, mixed with curiosity and recognition that is involved in arriving at a new culture. Writing from her own pioneering position of travel and education in Europe as a young Bengali woman, she evokes in surprisingly assured romantic terms the process of finding the linguistic and aesthetic means through which to articulate the discovery of sameness within difference. The above passage is almost characteristic of the deep tunneling that goes on throughout the book. Time and again, Boehmer, more like, burrows into the moment. Contrary impulses, anxiety, hesitation, curiosity, are teased out through her readings of gaps and ellipses. The power of memory, language, and form to reconstruct the original encounter are delicately hinted at, and a certain lyrical empathy is combined with a canny sophistication about the motives of her subjects. She also puts pressure on the poem's romantic vocabulary to reveal a much longer history of encounters, the investment of the Indian middle class in English literature. The encounter on the beach lights up, or rather, to use one of her phrases, is diagnostic of a larger hinterland of historical interconnectedness. Cultural history, private emotion, and literary form are fused and confused, or rather held in balance to the fabric of her prose. And I think this is one of the loveliest qualities of the book, that various points are being made, but often evolved to the texture of writing. What are the cultural, psychic, and formal pressures that informed Tarudat's staging of the scene? Was it rose-tinted remembrance, retrospective reconstruction, or colonial fantasy and wish fulfillment? In India, many of us middle-class Indians arrive in London so many times before we arrive. Through nursery rhymes, the Monopoly board, where I first encountered Piccadilly, colonial history, Shakespeare's Globe, family stories. For example, I grew up with all the stories of my various ancestors who had been there, and their obligatory portraits would be in various parts of our house. Now, many of their arrivals would be shaped by some of the arrivals that Boehmer excavates, just as my arrival in 1996 would be partly shaped by those. So it's a long tradition or trajectory that continues. And one of the marvels of the book is the way it balances the culture, the phenomenology, and the poetics of arrival. The encounters that she documents are encounters not just with new people, places, cultures, but also negotiation with family stories, memories, aspirations, anxieties, one's former self. And this combination of dialogue with the external world and internal dialogue with one's former self through the recesses of language is something where we see the art of Boehmer, the novelist. And I think this is one of its distinctive qualities, and that is something that often distinguishes it from becoming just a historical inquiry. There's a simultaneous process of excavation and meditation. Cosmopolitan thought zones, imperial dialectic, diasporic space, knotted histories. These critical concepts are registered and they underpin the work, but are often tested, nuanced, or extended by the reach of carefully historicized examples. If Boehmer calls her book a work of literary and cultural history, it also gives us, I think, a rich history of emotions. Threshold, and I was very surprised you mentioned the word only once in the whole book, I think is a crucial concept because, on the other hand, inter is a favorite word. Interpenetrate, intertwine, interplay, intercultural. Intercalcatate, I had to look up the dictionary to understand it. As she excavates the raw histories before they congeal into fixed identities of characters, like the emotions registered at the moment of encounter before they take up fixed position. The book breaks fresh ground both thematically and conceptually. At an immediate level, it's an important work of cultural excavation, as these men encounter, record, and in turn shape the British cultural sphere. And I'll leave it to Megan and Faisal to speak about the historical importance of the book. There is often an embalmed quality, as in the Parsi socialite and lawyer Cornelia Sorabji admiring the russet hues of Virginia creepers, or having tea with Walter Pater at Somerville, or, for example, the series of literary friendships that she brings alive, Yeats with Mohini Chatterjee, Manmohan Ghose and Lawrence Binion, or William Rothenstein and Tagore. But they also help us to reconceptualize colonial history as processes of encounter and exchange while being alert to unequal structures of power and hierarchies. I think few critics can beat Boehmer when it comes to the question of acknowledgement of or engagement with other critics. But what sets the book apart is the brilliant use, as I said, of the literary. And by that, I mean both as source material, poetry, fiction, stories, and also as methodology, close reading of particular pictures. I was really taken with your analysis of the photograph of Tagore and Rothenstein to tease out meanings. And I wondered that whether you faced any sort of limitation, because since you bring out the productive side of it, any limitations in mobilizing literature in order to do cultural history, because that's what many of us are trying to do. As I said, there's also a combination of empathy and canniness about our subjects. Self-interest, self-promotion, self-parading are often key to the encounters. Most evident, perhaps, in the section on the picture of Sarojini Naidu as the dreamy Oriental woman, or Cornelia Sorabji, zealously guarding her specialness. And I wonder, what is it in that culture that makes these people feel so special and parade their refined sensibility? Is it a combination of class, privilege, color, and slight insecurity of being a non-white colonial subject, coupled with an investment in specifically English culture? Because I was really struck by the extraordinary sense of entitlement that many of these characters have. And if I may so, I think this is a trajectory that continues in particular within particular kinds of South Asian post-colonial critics. And I think there is a parallel history going on, and what produces this sense of entitlement, of being marked out, so that when Sarojini Naidu is introduced at Buckingham Palace, everyone has to shake her hand individually. What is there behind it? Finally, I think the book is around kind of largely educated Indians encountering London, but around the fringes, there's a parallel history going on. As in that lovely word bandho, meaning tie, that you mentioned, two kind of sailors on the docks, they shout to each other, they kind of throw forth this word bandho, this Indian word. Or an Indian and an Algerian walking hand in hand on the docks. And I wonder whether there were any common spaces of encounter between the elite Indians in Bloomsbury or Oxford and these more ordinary people. And if there were, how did they write about it? What were the literary vocabularies? And if they didn't write about it, why are the silences? Is it because people were not interested? Or is there a certain embarrassment? We have nothing like, Gandhi being kind of thrown out of the train, but I'm sure there would have been experiences of racism, of humiliation. Where are the abject histories, and why are they again not represented in these writings? Finally, is there any Indian equivalent of a novel like Claude McKay's Banjo, about ordinary Indians meeting other migrant communities on the docks? But the space that you have delineated for us, it's a very, very rich and productive space, and I think it finally can ultimately pays tribute to the complex and contradictory histories of India. And I'll leave you now to kind of more historical things from Faisal and Megan.
Thank you very much. As Santanu said, this book invites meditation, and I'd like to meditate for the next few minutes on the many points of entry that this book fostered for me, on the crossing over between history and literature. As a historian who works with material both in English but often in Indian languages, but also someone who has studied literature just as an undergraduate, I found this book a fascinating opportunity to reflect on the productive ways that literature can inspire nuanced and meticulous cultural history. In the previous meditation, we started with the poem that began the book, and what struck me and what stayed with me was one of the final anecdotes recounted in the book, that of Susan Owen, who is the mother of a soldier, of a man who died on the field of battle in World War I, who died with an incomplete passage of Tagore's Gitanjali in his pocket. And this was a very apt representation of the extent to which the English had sincerely engaged with the literature of Tagore, and by extension, the kind of cultural cross-influences that Elleke so elegantly brought out throughout the book. And she writes to Tagore, begging him for the rest of the translation, because it's only a partial translation that was found in her son's pocket. And she never receives a reply. And this comes out as tragic as it seems. And to me, that was so indicative of the productive types of contradictions that are brought up again and again in this book. Not only the possibilities for interaction, for sincere engagement, but also the incompleteness, the yearning to complete an engagement that really can never be completed, again and again throughout the book. So I think that one of the primary strengths of Elleke's book, she's done such an impressive job of weaving a very meticulous tapestry through individual relationships at a very granular level. And in her own words, she unties what she calls the warp and weft of Indian and British influence throughout the period of time covered in this book, late 19th and early 20th century. And at the same time as she kind of graces us with this granular detail, the interaction between the metropole and the citizens of its most prized colonial possession, she highlights the backdrop of the stage as well on which they were acting, kind of bringing out, for instance, the development and increasing access to the Suez Canal, developments that acted a crucial part as players themselves in this cosmopolitan engagement with the metropole, with England on the part of Indians. So I think it has done the task of highlighting in really the only way that it can be done as a responsible cultural historian, I think through meticulous connection of individual interactions, relationships, readings of texts, and this is very much centered on the literary world. She's talked and shown the ways in which the metropole, England and India, were in conversation with each other in one specific world, that in which English literature became a common language through which these individuals could interact with each other productively. So I'd like to touch upon a few separate categories that sparked interest for me as a historian. One is thinking about the category of the urban and how the urban environment and the experience of it in colonial India offered an opportunity and an entry point for many of the characters described in the book coming to London for the first or multiple times. I also want to talk about how Elleke's book brings up new opportunities for thinking about literature and history in relation to each other, and also just end with a bit of reflection on the process of translation that she recounts in her book, and how, particularly in reference to Tagore, that's one example that really struck me in reading the book, reflected demonstrated a sense of self-knowledge, but also a sense of self-translation, standing at the gateway between the English-speaking world and his roots. So, to start off with a small reflection on the category of the urban, Elleke does an excellent job of drawing out how this space allowed an entrance for Malabari, for Gandhi, to enter into and interact with London in a way familiar as well as foreign. She mentions the architecture of the cities built up around colonial infrastructures, the familiar marketplace layout, the urban planning trends, as offering a sense of recognition, a spark of recognition for Indians traveling to London for the first time. But rather than emphasizing, as the risk could be, emphasizing the fact that these cities in India were models or modeled on the British environment, she instead very elegantly describes them as mirrors upon which Indians coming to London for the first time interact with agency in not just recognizing the city but also reshaping it. So in that sense, Elleke continuously emphasizes throughout the book that these are not guests, they are adaptive participants, leaving their mark through the founding and perpetuation of small groups of intellectuals, their interactions with academic institutions, like the one that we are sitting in today. And so Elleke very elegantly presents the city as a category that, rather than being static, is a product of the dialogue that she's trying to highlight. As for the relationship between literature and history, I think this is one of the best examples I've seen of how to approach literary texts, not simply as sources that reveal what was happening on the ground. This is often how historians have been tempted to use literature reflections on what the Suez Canal looked like, for instance, or when a particular act of construction occurred or ended. But instead, Elleke demonstrates how we can use them as opportunities for reflections on not only the author's engagement with the topics upon which they're writing, but also how they're used as entry points of engagement with fellow writers, with those part of the same intellectual milieu. And finally, just to end with a few words on the topic of translation and belonging. I was struck by Elleke's description of how Tagore found it very difficult to process fully his sensory experience of England while he was still in the country. It was, all of his reactions were described as generalized and blurred, and only appreciated in their singularity upon arrival at home. And this is also echoed in her entryway into her invoking Adela's example in A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. She feels the clouds of confusion that have plagued her in India close as she approaches the Suez Canal upon her return to London. Whereas, on the other hand, others in Elleke's book seem to find themselves only in the contrast provided by the London environment. Gandhi finds a renewed and very specific faith in his commitment to vegetarianism, in his discovery of a community of vegetarians in England, and only once he had experienced the difficulty of remaining committed to his vegetarian lifestyle. So a question I wanted to leave Elleke with is, to what extent do we have the process of translation as muddling here? To what extent is it a crucible? And do you think that it has to be one or the other? Or in many cases, do you think it must be irreconcilably both? I'd love to hear you reflect a bit more on that theme that emerged repeatedly in the text. And also in relation to the Lotus artists described in chapter 3, who tackled the subject of self-Orientalism and were represented, I think very aptly, as not simply buying into characterizations of themselves as Oriental, but instead acting as gateways themselves between a source self-identified Indianness in the English context, but also presenting themselves as the arbiters of their new, their identity founded in the crucible of the UK. So with that, I will hand over to Faisal Devji.
Thank you very much. I'll be picking up on some of the themes that both Santanu and Megan have so eloquently brought up. But let me begin by saying that it's actually rare to have a book that is as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside. It's an exquisite book with this lovely yellow color. Joseph Conrad, who makes an appearance in this book, in probably his most famous book, Heart of Darkness, begins with is it Marlowe sailing, the boat on the Thames, and the Thames then is said, this is a cliche by now. Suddenly, you're on the Thames outside London, and the Thames leads to the very ends of the world, to the ends of the earth. So there's a kind of quick dissolve, and suddenly you're in Africa. And it's that dissolve between the metropolis and the colony that I think Elleke recurses in many different ways through this book, so that what one tends to presuppose is a world of differences. The distinction between India and England, for instance, turns out to be, on closer inspection, very often the reverse. It's a world of not just confluences, but of confusions. The problem is not that people are too distinct from each other, that these countries are too different from one another, but that they are too confusingly the same in some fashion. So I just want to say a bit about that. When the famous 19th century Muslim reformer Sir Syed Ahmad Khan travels to London in the 1870s. He writes letters which are published back in India in Urdu. Eventually these are collected and he writes a book called, interestingly enough, Musafiran-e-London, Travelers to London, London, not Britain, not Europe, not anything else, London, the capital of the empire. But the first of these letters, the first few chapters of his book actually are in Bombay. It's almost as if he can't tell the difference. You know, where does India end and London begin? Is Bombay part of London? So you have this kind of interesting ethnographic descriptions of Bombay, the people of Bombay. You know, when he gets on the ship, the boat in Bombay, you know, to embark upon this outward journey through the Suez Canal, etc. You know, he meets a Parsi, and he gives us descriptions of Gujarati and says, "Oh, how interesting it is that Gujarati is actually very much like Urdu." He's never encountered this language before. But the way in which he describes it is almost as if the journey has already begun. England already, or London already begins in Bombay, and before he approaches the English language, Gujarati serves as it were, a mediating force there. And this sort of sense of confusion, or rather this inability to draw firm geographical boundaries, you find everywhere. And maybe this is why canals, straits, isthmuses, etc. are so important in this world of travelers, but also in the way in which people then envisioned the empire. It is almost as if the smallest parts of this vast non-contiguous empire spread across the surface of the earth can only be grasped in their smallest aspects, in their narrowest bits. And the Suez Canal, that wonderful chapter that Elleke has written in this book, we see over and over again through many examples how often space is transmuted into time. It's the time that it takes to go through the Suez Canal that somehow is essential in marking the difference between the East and the West, between Bombay and London, India and Britain. And there are endless descriptions of how boring it is and how occasionally interesting it might be, etc. So when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is going through the canal, for him, of course, there's something else happening there, because as he's going through the canal serves as kind of gallery, because he's passing through what for him is a previous empire, the Mohammedan Empire, right, the Muslim Empire, and it's almost as if he can see it passing before his eyes. So between India and England comes a ghost, the ghost of the Mohammedan past. And there's always the temptation among Muslim travelers to get off that boat and to ride off, or to be off to Cairo or to Mecca or wherever, and some of them do. But most of them have to content themselves with Aden, right? And Port Said. This, I think, is a nice example of the way in which the Suez Canal in particular serves as a kind of, if you will, a kind of sphincter almost, right? That makes that divides the two parts of the imperial body.
Which way?
Yes. See that? It goes in reverse as well. This is the problem. Now, the famous or infamous German jurist Carl Schmitt remarks somewhere, who of course wrote about land and sea, so he writes about space and empire, remarks upon the fact that the British Empire is so territorially non-contiguous and fragmented, that fragmentation causes a great deal of anxiety, and therefore one must focus on these straits and canals and sea lanes and things like that, because it can only be grasped at its narrowest points. It's the connecting bits that are really important in conceiving of the empire, rather than the large continental spaces which apparently manifest it. And I would like to think, and I think this is more than speculation on my part, that the way in which people like Syed Ahmad Khan come to imagine, not just to see the Mohammedan past as they are going through the canal, but to imagine a Muslim world of the future is very often the model of this British Empire, which is disconnected. It's no longer the Ottoman Empire as a contiguous territorial unit. It's a new vision of something that comes to be called precisely in this period the Muslim world, which is spread all over the world, and which is not and can never be under a single political authority. Now, of course, that contrasts with the British Empire, but the way in which people like Syed Ahmad Khan and after him, and in the very early years of the 20th century and much later as well, of course, inhabit London, and London gets to be the capital, not Istanbul, of a group that tries to imagine the future Muslim world on the model, I would argue, of the British Empire. That is crucial here as well. It's very, very important. And perhaps that's why London is the significant referent here. Even though, of course, Elleke's book has, as a kind of subtext, hidden by the focus on London, is Oxford. So you have all of these figures, or many of these figures, many of the most important ones, of course, make pilgrimages to Oxford. And so you have Shyamji Krishna Varma in 1896 coming to 11 Norham Gardens to meet Professor Max Muller, the famous Indologist. That's Swami Vivekananda coming to meet Max Muller. Shyamji Krishna Varma, who is the editor of a journal called the Indian Sociologist, and a well-known militant figure, condemned as a terrorist, also is in Oxford, is a student. He's one of the earliest students, Elleke tells us, of the Indian Institute, the building of which still exists, though the Indians have long been evicted from it. And part of the grand procession that goes down Broad Street to open it in the 1880s. It might, it's of some small interest to know that in the recent visit of the Indian Prime Minister to this country, Shyamji Krishna Varma was the man precisely rehabilitated. The man condemned as a terrorist has had his name put back on the rolls on the, I think at Lincoln's Inn, one of the Inns of Court, where he studied to be a lawyer. So, one set of terrorists have been rehabilitated and another are going in the opposite direction. So just as London gets to be a kind of site where you can imagine this new thing called the Muslim world, where Pan-Islamism comes to be theorized by figures who are writing slightly later than the period Elleke is dealing with. And they're doing it in London, as I said, they're not doing it in Constantinople. So too this city gets to be the site in which India is writ large, whether as a great civilization or indeed as a specifically Hindu civilization. And Shyamji Krishna Varma is part of that, that logic as well. Here too then, London is, it's not clear whether it is a destination or itself another stepping stone, another site, another visiting point in the larger journey back home. Thank you.
I'd like very much to thank the three respondents for their insights and very inspiring and encouraging remarks. I think you kind of you got the vision very much of the book in your different ways and from your different perspectives. I also wanted to say thank you very much to the Torch team for putting this panel together. It's in many ways a dream panel of respondents for the book. And I'm delighted too that Professor Jamie Belich of the Global History Centre was able to chair, because insofar as Indian arrivals is a story of how migration shapes transnational imaginations, it is also, I always hoped, a contribution to global history, this book. So I'm just going to say just a few really synoptic remarks about just trying to put in a nutshell what I was trying to achieve here, and in doing that, I think offer perhaps two responses to some of the comments that we've heard. So with this very pretty book, it was my hope not just to explore the central place of India in the British metropolitan imagination in the late 19th century leading up to the First World War, but perhaps more ambitiously to think about what cultural arrival means in all senses of the word, especially here when it came to travelling Indians. I wanted to explore how the imperial metropolis, often seen as sealed off from its peripheries and borderlands, was in fact moulded through and through by ideas and influences and images and flavours from outside, and in this case, India. And India in this book, it should be said, is the Indian subcontinent, now Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. And actually Sri Lanka, Ceylon features in this history also. So in previous work, I have been very preoccupied with tracing some of the lateral interactions between different colonial and peripheral spaces in the empire in around the same period. So, for example, the nationalist hand-holding, the cooperative hand-holding between Indians and Irish in the 1880s, 1890s. In this study, I was keen to explore how lateral relations between the centre and its margins operated. So I was interested in swiveling what is often seen as a vertical relationship between the centre of empire and, if you like, its colonial satellites, just to swivel that vertical axis in a more horizontal, lateral direction, and to subvert the usual top-down way in which these influences and migratory pathways worked. So that was something of a challenge, and the three respondents have very much given a picture of some of the ways in which I approached that challenge. I'm very grateful also to the remarkable subjects that I look at in this book, these remarkable Indian arrivants, as I call them, scholars, poets, religious seekers, and political activists, including, as you heard, Toru Dutt, Sarojini Naidu, M.K. Gandhi, and Rabindranath Tagore. And in taking them, what I wanted to do by approaching them in order to answer that challenge was to look at how their presence, how their writings, how their involvements, their relationship and their studies had itself a shaping effect on how cosmopolitan life in the imperial capital was not only conceived and imagined, but was in fact lived. How what I call intercultural hospitality was expressed, how it was, as it were, lived on the pulses and through writing. Because important to remember that this is a time of high imperialism. That's why I'm particularly fascinated by it. It's the time of the apex of formal imperialism. And of course, racism was absolutely rife, especially, of course, in its raw form on the colonial frontier. So perhaps more particularly in responding to that challenge, I was keen to look at how these travelling Indians brought to Britain a far wider and more radical conception of the West, what I call the expanded West, a term that I borrow from the work of Amitav Ghosh. How they brought a concept of the expanded West, a far wider and more ecumenical concept than Europe had entertained up to this point. And so how Orientalism was a construction that Indian writers, seers and travellers responded to in knowing, self-promoting, career-enhancing ways. We have that interplay there of self-translation and self-promotion that Megan Robb's comments there very beautifully highlighted. How these traveling Indians also were often more worldly, more knowledgeable, more modern, self-consciously modern than their British hosts and counterparts, partly due to the effects of a colonial education, as we've heard, due to being steeped in English literature, to which they'd been exposed through that education, and also due to the effects of travel, that translation of, if you like, differences of time into space that Faisal Devji touched on. And then finally, and this is the sort of the culmination point to which the book moves, how finally, in a very concrete way, still thinking about answering that challenge, how it was the case that over 1 million Indian sepoys shored up the Western Front, shored up the West, if you like, in the autumn of 1915, exactly 100 years ago. So safeguarding the West, for better or for worse, in a concrete and a very crucial way. And finally, one of the things that I wanted to achieve here was to explore the fine complexities and ambivalences of the colonial encounter through the integument, through the very textures of the writings that these travellers produced themselves, through that warp and weft of poetry, of letters, of diaries. No novels, to respond to Shantanu's question, no novels, to my knowledge, were produced by these travelling Indians in this particular period. That we, as it were, had to wait for Mulkaraj Anand to write, to produce his work in the 1930s and 1940s. So were there limitations to that methodology, if you like, tracing some of the contradictions and nuances of the Indian-British encounter through the warp and the weft of writing? Yes, the limitation was that I was thereby confined to a great extent to the productions, the literary productions of the elite and of, if you like, British elites and Indian elites encountering one another, both on ships and on British soil. I did some deep digging in the censuses of 1901 and 1911, which showed a very interesting detail, the numbers of families bearing names like Ali and Lal and Das and Dos, spelled all kinds of different ways. The numbers of families concentrated around the London Docklands, for example, also the Bristol Docks, which of course testifies to a kind of a different sedimentation of Indian travel and Indian migration to these islands, but these were not literary texts. So that was, if you like, one of the potential limitations of the literary methodology that I apply. But it was so productive and rich in other ways in the kinds of nuances of, as we were saying, self-translation and self-promotion, that I, in most cases, just kind of went with it. So it was these documents of travel in different genres that brought me to some of my understanding here, to my understanding of Indian arrival, showing how travel and life writing can work in proleptic ways to project a traveller into space so that when he or she arrives, she or he knows the place at once for the first and the second time, at once. So thank you very much.